Her little brother opened the door to her voice, but it was a trap made by the Mafia's enemy. Danny thought Serena was calling for him from the hallway. He heard her voice say, "Come here, I need you." So he opened the door. But it wasn't Serena. Franco Bianchi had stolen her voice, used it like a weapon, and kidnapped a child to break Dante Moretti. When Serena found Danny Spent's spacebook near the service door, her world collapsed. The Mafia boss had promised safety. Franco proved safety was only as strong as the smallest door no one thought to guard. The ruined dining room had become a trap made of glass, dust, and unfinished truth. Serena Hayes heard the pistol click instead of fire. Danny was tied near the bar and Dante Moretti was on his knees. Franco Bianchi smiled as if fear were a private language. Her courage was not clean or cinematic. It lived in shaking fingers, in the decision to keep looking at Danny, and in the refusal to let Franco define what her brother was worth. She noticed details because details had saved her before. The distance between the gunman and the bar, the angle of Dante's shoulders, the tremor in Danny's knees. Fear wanted to make the room simple, but the room was not simple. It held guilt, love, strategy, and a child who had no business being there. Serena understood that ordinary people often became collateral because powerful men believed the world would absorb the damage. She had spent years absorbing damage. That ended here, even if her hand would not stop shaking. Harbor Road returned to Serena whenever fear found a new shape. She remembered Harbor Road and the night her parents died. Newspapers had called it gang-related traffic violence. The clean phrase had never described the scarf, the watch, or Danny crying. Dante had built his life around locked doors, loyal men, and decisions made before anyone could question him. Serena had built hers around consent, bills, school schedules, and the painful dignity of asking for help only when necessary. Their instincts collided in nearly every room. He wanted to protect first and explain later. She wanted the explanation before she accepted protection. Between them stood Danny, listening more than adults realized. That made every silence dangerous. If Dante stepped back, Danny saw it. If Serena corrected him, Danny saw that too. Trust was forming not from speeches but from repeated corrections. Dante was learning that love did not excuse command. Serena was learning that refusal could coexist with accepting help. Before Dante Moretti entered her life, survival had already narrowed Serena's world. Serena worked double shifts and raised Danny alone. She had left law school after the funeral. Every bill reminded her that survival could become its own prison. Consequences had been Serena's inheritance. She inherited debt, legal confusion, Danny's lunch forms, and the quiet shame that came when strangers assumed their parents must have been involved in something criminal. That was why she hated easy explanations. Easy explanations allowed everyone else to sleep. The truth was messier and more useful. It showed who paid, who lied, who looked away, and who was left holding a child's hand in a hallway. Dante's apology could not repair that. It could only become the first brick in a structure built from evidence, restitution, and choices made when forgiveness was not guaranteed. The morning before Dante ever entered Bella Vita, Serena woke before her alarm, because the radiator in the apartment began knocking like somebody trapped inside the wall. She lay still for a few seconds and listened to Danny, breathing on the other side of the thin partition they called a bedroom wall. The apartment had been rented as a one-bedroom, but after their parents died, Serena had hung curtains across the living room and told Danny that privacy could be invented when money could not buy it. Their mother would have laughed at that. Their father would have measured the room 3 times and built a better divider himself. Serena missed both reactions with an ache, so familiar it had become part of the furniture. She rose quietly, made instant coffee, and opened the folder of bills on the kitchen table. Each paper used polite language to say the same thing: keep paying for what grief interrupted. Danny came out wearing one sock and carrying his spacebook. He asked whether astronauts ever had to worry about rent. Serena said astronauts probably had paperwork too. He made a face and poured cereal into a chipped bowl. That ordinary morning mattered later, because it proved how much of their life had been built from small negotiations. She was not waiting for a dangerous man to save her. She was trying to keep one child fed, educated, and laughing despite a world that had already taken too much. Before school, Danny paused at the door and asked if she would be home before midnight. Serena lied with kindness and said yes. Then she watched him walk down the hall, backpack too heavy, shoulders too straight, trying to look older than 12. She wanted to call him back and hug him again. Instead, she let him go, because love also meant allowing a child to move through the world without seeing every fear in your face. Mira understood that kind of survival better than anyone at Bella Vita. She had found Serena crying in the storage room during her 3rd week at the restaurant. After a customer complained that Serena looked distracted while serving his anniversary dinner. Mira had shut the door, handed her a clean napkin, and said, "Cry for 3 minutes. Then we go back out and pretend rich people invented patience." Serena had laughed through tears. And friendship began there. Mira was loud in the kitchen, careful with tips, and tender only when no one was watching. She knew which regulars grabbed wrists, which tables tipped in folded bills, and which managers confused silence with discipline. On the afternoon before the shooting, Mira had noticed a stranger near the delivery entrance, asking too many questions about schedules. He wore a pale jacket despite the heat. His smile was polite, but his eyes moved like he was measuring exits. Mira told Carlo, the temporary security guard, that the man made her uncomfortable. Carlo laughed and said she watched too many crime shows. That laugh stayed with her afterward. It was the laugh of someone who already knew the answer to a question she had not asked. She did not tell Serena, because the dinner rush swallowed the warning. Ordinary work has a cruel talent for burying the first sign of danger beneath urgent little tasks. On Friday night, Bella Vita glowed, as if nothing dangerous could pass through its doors. Candlelight moved across wine glasses, gold frames, polished forks, and the faces of people who believed money could purchase distance from fear. Serena did not believe that. Fear had eaten dinner beside her for years. It had sat at the kitchen table when the rent notice came. It had stood in the school office when Danny needed a guardian signature instead of a parent. It had followed her into law school hallways until tuition pushed her back out. Still, the restaurant could pretend for a while. Mira moved through the service station with 2 trays and a pencil tucked above her ear, whispering rude little reviews of customers under her breath. Luis stacked clean plates near the kitchen and showed Serena a picture of his baby sister wearing a ridiculous pink bow. For 10 minutes, life almost looked ordinary. Then Dante Moretti entered, and ordinary folded itself away. The owner rushed forward so fast that his smile arrived before the rest of his face. The manager touched his tie, then touched it again. Conversation softened. A man at table 6 stopped laughing in the middle of a sentence. Serena saw Nico first, because Nico moved like a man trained to see exits before faces. Then she saw Dante. Midnight blue suit, black hair pushed back, ink climbing from his collar and wrists. Handsome in a way that felt like a warning, not an invitation. He looked around only once, but the room behaved as if he had counted every weakness inside it. Mira leaned close to Serena and whispered, "Please tell me table 14 is not yours." Serena checked the chart. Of course it was. The manager came to her with a voice too careful to be normal. "Mr. Moretti requested you personally." Serena stared at him. "Why would he know me?" The manager avoided her eyes. "Do not ask that. Be polite. Be fast, give him whatever he wants." The sentence landed like a hand around her throat. Serena needed the job. Danny needed shoes. Their electric bill needed mercy it would not receive. But need had been mistaken for permission too many times in her life. She picked up a tray and served every table except Dante's. She refilled water. She delivered bread. She smiled at a tourist who asked whether the pesto was spicy. Each time she passed table 14, the restaurant held its breath. Mira's eyes begged her to stop. Serena kept walking. It was not courage exactly. It was exhaustion sharpened into refusal. Dante waited longer than Serena expected. That was the first thing about him that annoyed her. A bully would have snapped quickly. Dante watched, measured, and allowed the silence to become a performance. At last he lifted 2 fingers. "Excuse me." His voice was quiet, but quiet could be its own kind of command. Serena heard him. She reached for a pitcher already full and pretended she had not. A tiny gasp came from table 10. Then Nico appeared beside her. "Mr. Moretti would like a word." "I am working." Now, his politeness had the weight of a locked door. Serena's legs obeyed before her pride finished arguing, and she hated her body for that. Fear could move a person. It did not have to own the voice that followed. At table 14, Dante gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Sit." Serena remained standing. "I have other tables. They can wait. So can you." Nico shifted behind her. Dante did not. His mouth almost curved, as if refusal had become a language he wanted to study. "Your name?" "Serena." "Last name?" "You requested me. You probably know it already." The corner of his smile disappeared. Good, she thought. Let him feel 1 second of discomfort in a room trained to flatter him. "You know who I am," he said. "Yes." "Then you know people usually answer when I call." Serena looked directly at him. "Maybe that is the problem." The booth went still. Somewhere behind her, a fork touched porcelain too loudly. Dante leaned back, but his eyes sharpened. Do you speak to all guests this way? Only the ones who make everyone else afraid to breathe. Fear keeps people alive. No, respect does that. Fear keeps people quiet. Something moved behind his face, fast and private. Serena did not know whether she had angered him or interested him, and she refused to care. Then he said the words that made the floor vanish. Your parents died on Harbor Road. Her hand tightened around her order pad. How do you know that? He took too long to answer. I asked questions. About a waitress. About someone who did not fit where life placed her. Do not make stalking sound poetic. One of Dante's men inhaled sharply. Dante raised a hand and the man said nothing. You are right, Dante said. It was not poetic. The admission disturbed her more than denial. You do not get to reach into my grief because you are bored. I was not bored. Then you were worse. You were interested. He looked at her for one silent second. Yes, Serena stood. Then lose interest. She had taken 3 steps from the booth when the front door slammed against the wall. 2 men entered with caps low over their faces. One shouted in Italian. Serena turned because everyone turned. Dante moved before her mind understood. He caught her around the waist and pulled her down so hard the breath left her. A bullet tore through the wooden partition, exactly where her head had been. The restaurant became screaming glass. Wine exploded across white cloth. Plates broke. The violinist dropped his bow and crawled under the podium. Nico overturned the table and fired back. Serena could feel Dante above her. Not crushing but covering. His body between her and the doorway. Stay down, he said. His voice had lost every polished edge. Luis fell near the kitchen door. Serena saw him before she saw the blood. He reached for the steel counter, missed, and went down hard. Luis, she tried to rise. Dante held her down. No, he is bleeding. You will be too. He is 19. Dante followed her eyes. Something in his jaw changed. Mario, get him. One of Dante's men crossed the open space in a crouch, grabbed Luis by the collar and belt, and dragged him behind the pastry station. While bullets chewed the bar mirror into silver rain, Serena stared at Dante because mercy sounded strange in his mouth. The contradiction made him harder to hate cleanly, and she resented him for that too. When the shooting broke, it did not end. It scattered. The attackers retreated through the front, but Nico shouted that more could be outside. Dante pulled Serena through the kitchen. Steam burned the air. Cooks cried beside sacks of flour. Serena grabbed the doorframe. Mira, my men have her side covered. That is not an answer. It is the only one I can give while bullets are still deciding. She hated the sentence and the reality inside it. At the alley, a black SUV waited. Serena tried to pull away again. Dante opened the door. Call him from the car. I am not going anywhere with you. He faced her then, and urgency stripped him of charm. If I leave you here, the men who miss me will come back to learn why I protected you. Get in. She wanted to reject him. She also knew he was right. That was the first trap. Inside the moving SUV, her hands shook too badly to unlock her own phone. Dante gave her his. No speech. No ownership. Just the phone. She dialed Danny from memory. He answered sleepy and scared. Serena, lock the door. All of them. Windows, too. Stay away from the front window. What happened? Now, Danny. She listened to the chain slide. The latch snap. The thin apartment becoming the only wall between her brother and whatever Dante had dragged to their door. When Danny asked if she was hurt, she looked at Dante's bleeding cuff and said, Not badly. Nico glanced into the mirror. Gray sedan outside her building. Stolen plates. 11 minutes before we arrived. Serena's stomach turned to ice. Dante did not soften the answer. They may already know where he is. She wanted to strike him for the truth, and cling to him for not lying. Both impulses frightened her. The clinic under the fake import office looked too clean for the night that had brought them there. Luis was carried through white doors by a doctor who asked no questions. Serena stood with dried blood on her palms while Dante gave orders in low Italian. She caught words she understood. Hospital. Mother. Money. Protection. Criminal money could move faster than honest systems. And that made her angry in a new way. When Dante said Luis's bills would be handled, Serena said, That does not fix what happened. No, he answered, but it fixes one thing. She had no reply because he was right. A good action from a dangerous man did not make him good. It still helped the person bleeding. Serena hated how complicated survival could become. Somewhere above them, the city continued, as if a child was not locking a cheap apartment door in the dark because powerful men had brought violence to dinner. Serena's apartment seemed smaller when armed men waited below the street lamp. Dante waited under a street lamp while Serena went inside alone. Danny packed pajamas, his tablet, and the photograph of their parents. The normal objects made the night feel even more unreal. Danny met Dante with the suspicion of a child who had already learned too much. Danny asked if Dante was truly a mafia boss. Dante said people could lie and Danny should watch what he did. Serena noticed that he did not demand trust from a child. The villa by the bay looked peaceful in a way Serena did not trust. The safe house overlooked the bay and smelled of lemon oil. Carmela fussed over everyone with hot chocolate and clean towels. Evil would have been easier if the house had looked cruel. The guest room offered soft sheets, locked doors, and no easy sleep. Dante explained the locks, the guards, and the hallway. He stayed outside the threshold, instead of stepping into Serena's borrowed refuge. Small boundaries should not have mattered so much, yet they did. Their first quiet conversation happened through a half-open door. Dante brought tea and answered without pretending to be innocent. Serena admitted she sometimes missed being a daughter instead of an emergency contact. He told her she should have had more help. After Dante brought Serena and Danny to the villa, Danny did not sleep through the whole night. Serena thought he did until she woke and found his daybed empty. Panic hit her before reason did. She ran into the sitting room and saw the balcony door still locked, the hallway quiet, and Danny sitting on the floor beside the bookshelf with a flashlight in his mouth. He had opened a book about ships and was drawing a map on the back of an envelope. "What are you doing?" Serena whispered. He startled, then looked guilty, checking exits. That answer made her sit down hard. Dante, who had been passing in the hall, stopped outside the open door but did not step in. Danny noticed him and stiffened. Dante lifted both hands. "I can leave." Danny studied him. "Do you know all the exits?" "Yes, because you are dangerous. Because danger exists." Danny considered that. "Show me without making it weird." Serena almost objected, but Dante looked at her first. Permission." She nodded once. For the next 10 minutes, Dante stood in the doorway and explained the villa like a fire safety plan rather than a fortress. Main stairs, service hall, kitchen, exits it, panic room, garden path. He did not dramatize it. He did not say no one could hurt them. He said, "Knowing where to go helps your mind stop inventing 10,000 places." Danny listened with the grave attention he usually gave documentaries. When Dante finished, Danny said, "You are not as stupid as criminals on television." Dante blinked. Serena covered her mouth. "Thank you." Dante said, "I think." Danny returned to his map, then added a small square near the kitchen. "Carmela's hot chocolate station," he said. Dante nodded solemnly. "Strategically essential." It was the first time Danny smiled in that house. That fragile trust grew by inches. The next morning, Danny found Dante in the library staring at a chessboard. Serena watched from the doorway, while pretending to answer messages. Danny asked if Dante knew how to play. Dante said yes. Danny asked if he cheated. Dante said only at cards, and only when the other person cheated first. Danny approved of that more than he should have. They played in silence at first. Dante won quickly. Danny frowned and demanded a rematch. Dante won again. Serena expected Danny to sulk, but he leaned closer to the board and asked why he kept losing the center. Dante explained without softening the lesson. He did not let Danny win because Danny was scared. He did not call him brave in that adult voice children recognize as pity. He treated Danny's mind like it deserved a real opponent. After the third game, Danny looked toward Serena and said, "I think maybe he is not a bad man all the way." Serena felt the words like a hand around her heart. Dante did not smile. He looked down at the board as if the sentence had given him something heavier than praise. "Do not decide that too fast," he said. Danny tilted his head. Why? Dante moved a captured pawn between his fingers. "Because people should earn the safer parts of what you believe about them." Serena looked at him then, really looked, and for 1 second she hated that he was capable of saying something so careful. It would have been easier if he had been only cruel. Morning made the danger look almost insulting. Breakfast waited on the patio as if violence had not crossed the city. Dante said Luis would walk again. Serena corrected him when he sounded too much like money-solved wounds. Nico's report turned breakfast into another crime scene. The shooters were dead identities paid through a shell tied to Franco. Dante admitted the attack may have tested whether Serena mattered. The word mattered frightened her more than the guns. Mira's warning carried the sound of a normal life being pulled into the dark. Mira called from Bella Vita and whispered about a man asking Serena's schedule. The man had spoken to a temporary guard near the delivery door. Franco had studied the room before anyone knew the room was dangerous. Franco's first message proved he was already inside the edges of their safety. Dante received the words, "You protect walls. I study doors." Another line told Serena that the dead still spoke. The threat felt patient, intimate, and already inside the house, far from the villa. Franco watched the fear he had planted begin to move. Across the city, Franco replayed footage of Dante shielding Serena. He understood that affection could be more useful than territory. He planned to use truth because truth hurt longer than bullets. The study door stood open just enough for the past to step out. Serena had gone looking for a bathroom and found a wall of files instead. Property records, photographs, newspaper clippings, and labeled boxes arranged with the cold care of a man who believed information could keep the world obedient. One folder carried the name Harbor Road. She stopped breathing before she touched it. Inside were traffic stills, insurance forms, witness summaries, and the date that had split her life in half. Dante appeared in the doorway before she finished the first page. He did not ask what she was doing. He looked at the folder and went pale. "Tell me this is not what I think it is," Serena said. Dante's silence answered first. Then he said, "I was not the driver. But you knew." Yes, the word landed harder because he did not wrap it in excuses. Serena's hands began to shake. He told her the pursuit had begun after Franco's men tried to kill one of his. He had ordered his people to follow. Franco's driver ran the red light. Her parents swerved. Another car clipped them. The report had become convenient, vague, and false enough for powerful men to sleep. Serena slapped him before she knew she would. Dante accepted it. That made her angrier. She hit his chest once. Then again, because 6 years of hospital hallways, unpaid bills, and Danny asking for dead voices had nowhere else to go. "I had to choose coffins for people who still had laundry in the dryer," she said. "Do you understand that?" Dante's face broke around the edges. "Not enough." Serena found the anonymous scholarship in the file next. The emergency payment. The school balance that had disappeared for 1 semester, before life dragged her out anyway. "You sent money. I wanted to help. You wanted to quiet your guilt. Both," he said. The honesty did not cleanse anything. It only made the wound more precise. She threw the folder at him. Papers scattered across the polished floor. "You do not get to protect me now and call it redemption. You do not get to be kind for 1 night and erase 6 years. I am not asking to erase it." "Then what are you asking?" His answer came low. "A chance to keep Franco from taking anything else from you." Serena looked at him and knew the most terrible part. She needed that chance even while she hated him for making it necessary. Before either of them could speak again, Dante's phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number. A photograph appeared. Danny in the villa library that morning, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his space book. The picture had been taken from outside the window. The message beneath it read, "She still trusts you." For 1 second, Serena's anger became pure animal fear. Dante shouted for Nico. Guards moved through the house. Carmela pulled Danny into an interior room. Nico found 7 missing seconds on the east camera and a delivery van ghosting down the lower road. Franco was not attacking a fortress. He was teaching them that every fortress had a servant door, a camera blind spot, a borrowed uniform, a human habit. That night, Danny sat beside Serena on the floor and asked the question adults spend years avoiding. Can bad people do good things? Serena looked at the closed door where Dante stood guard in the hall. Yes, can good people do bad things? She thought of her own lies, told to keep him calm. She thought of Dante's hidden file. She thought of Franco turning truth into a weapon. Yes, Danny hugged his knees. Then how do we know who to trust? Serena swallowed. We watch what they choose next. Not what they promise. What they choose. Later Dante knocked, waited for permission, and placed a blanket on the chair instead of around her shoulders. Serena almost reached for him because grief wanted warmth. Then she saw the ink across his knuckles and remembered her father's broken watch. She pulled her hand back. Dante noticed and did not punish her with hurt. That silence was the closest thing to respect he could offer. Near dawn, a red dot slid across the wall above Danny's blanket. Serena rolled him to the floor as glass cracked. Alarms screamed. Dante entered with a gun and terror naked on his face. After the shots stopped, he reached toward Danny and waited. Danny, shaking so hard his teeth clicked, crawled into his arms. For 1 fragile second, Serena saw Trust arrive wounded and trembling. Then Nico came to the doorway with the news that destroyed it. A temporary guard with forged papers had vanished from the East Service Hall. That hall led to the interior room. Serena ran before anyone could protect her from the answer. The sofa was empty. Danny's blanket lay on the floor. His spacebook was bent near the service door, and he hated bent pages. They found the device behind a laundry cart. Cheap, disposable, loaded with Serena's voice cut from her call in the SUV. Come here. I need you. Franco had not needed to invent fear. He had stolen hers and played it to a child. The note came on a Bella Vita card. If you want the boy alive, come back to where it began. Dante and the girl. No police. Serena's knees failed, and Dante caught her. She pushed him away. You promised he was safe. Dante flinched as if she had shot him. I know, he is a child. I know, Nico said it was a trap. Dante said yes. Serena wiped her face until focus replaced panic. I am going. Dante refused. She stepped close enough to make him hear every word. You said I am not yours. Prove it. Let me choose. He looked like the sentence hurt more than the bullet in his arm. Then he brought her a vest and a compact pistol, only to protect life. He said, never for anger, never for revenge. Serena took it because innocence had no armor, and Danny was waiting where fear already knew his name. The drive back to Bella Vita made the city look cruelly ordinary. Serena rode toward Bella Vita with Danny's spacebook in her lap. Ordinary people moved past the windows as if her world had not collapsed. The cruelty of disaster was that streets kept living. Danny's call came through thin, frightened, and impossibly brave. Franco let Danny speak, and the boy apologized for opening the door. Serena told him adults who trick children carry the blame. Dante heard Danny ask him not to die. In the alley, Serena refused to let Dante confuse dying with loving. Serena warned Dante not to turn sacrifice into love. Danny did not need another dead person to miss. Dante promised to try to come back, instead of promising what no one could control. Returning to Bella Vita felt like walking into the mouth of the night before. The bell above Bella Vita's door sounded cheerful in the ruined room. Serena saw the partition, where a bullet should have taken her. Memory and present collided under the same broken glass. Franco had staged the ruined restaurant like a theater built for humiliation. Franco stood in a pale suit with Danny held near the bar. He greeted Dante like an old friend invited to a private humiliation. Every chair, stain, and shattered mirror had become part of his theater. His revelation about the missing witness struck harder because Danny was still in danger. Franco claimed a missing witness had seen the truth of Harbor Road. He said Dante knew enough to send money, but not enough to understand the ugliness. The revelation was designed to split Serena's attention from her brother. Dante knelt without negotiation, and even the gunman seemed to understand what it cost. Franco ordered Dante to drop his weapon and get on his knees. Dante obeyed without bargaining because Danny was watching. Fear left the room for a second and became something like awe. Serena fired because the alternative was watching a child become a message. Serena stepped forward with a pleading voice and a hidden hand. She shot the man holding Danny in the shoulder. It was not beautiful or clean, but it opened a door. When the pistol jammed, time slowed into dust, sunlight, and terror. Danny ran behind the pillar while Dante fought the man with the ties. Serena aimed at Franco and heard only the pistol click. The smallest sound in the world became the loudest. Nico took the bullet before anyone could name the choice he made. Nico took a bullet meant for Serena and fell against a table. Dante disarmed the shooter, but could not stop the blood spreading. Loyalty became physical and terrible on the floor. Alvarez entered with police, sirens, and the first chance at a report that might tell the truth. Police entered with guns raised, and Detective Alvarez recognized Serena. She spoke before anyone could reduce the night to a gang shootout. The truth needed a witness who refused to be quiet. The first statement began beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look more breakable. At the station, Serena began with Danny instead of Dante. Alvarez let the boy sit close and did not call fear weakness. Respect looked like water, time and questions without contempt. Danny's guilt was quieter than his tears and more dangerous. Danny blamed himself for opening the door to the fake voice. Alvarez and Serena told him responsibility belonged to the adults who deceived him. Children often blamed themselves because guilt felt like control. The minutes after the rescue did not feel like victory to Danny. People kept touching him gently, asking him questions gently, wrapping blankets around him gently, and each gentle thing made him want to scream. At the station, when Alvarez asked whether he could describe the man who took him, Danny stared at the tabletop and said he remembered shoes. Black shoes with mud at the edges, a small tear near the lace. He remembered the smell of cigarettes and mint gum. He remembered Serena's voice coming from the hallway, and how relief had moved faster than thought. Then he remembered the cloth over his mouth. His hands began to shake. Alvarez stopped the question immediately. That is enough for now. Danny looked up, ashamed. I should remember more. Serena's chair scraped as she moved closer. No. Her voice was firm enough to cut through the buzzing lights. Your job was to survive, not collect evidence. Alvarez nodded. Your brain gave us what it could. We can work with shoes. Danny blinked. Shoes matter. Shoes matter, Alvarez said. Later, that detail helped identify Carlo from a traffic camera outside the service road. Danny did not know that until weeks later. When he found out, he stood a little taller, not because the kidnapping became less terrible, but because one remembered detail had become useful without making him responsible for the crime. The flash drive made the past legal, visible, and harder to deny. Franco's drive showed the missing witness statement and payments to a retired officer. It proved that both families had helped bury pieces of the truth. Serena learned that harm can happen once and then be repeated by silence. Franco's first night in custody showed Serena another kind of danger. The city did not simply turn against him. Parts of it tried to protect him. A lawyer arrived before dawn with a suit that cost more than Serena's rent. 2 officers suddenly forgot which evidence bag held the audio device. A local reporter published a story suggesting the Bella Vita incident was a feud over a woman, as if Serena were a romantic prize instead of a sister with a kidnapped child. Alvarez was furious in the controlled way honest detectives become furious when corruption wears procedure as a coat. He called Serena and told her not to read comments. She did, anyway. People who knew nothing wrote with great confidence. Some called Dante a hero. Some called Serena stupid. Some said Danny should not have been near criminals. Serena closed the laptop before she threw it. Danny stood in the doorway and asked why strangers were allowed to talk about them. She did not have a perfect answer. Because people confuse distance with wisdom, she said. He thought about that. Can we be quiet online and loud in court? She smiled despite everything. That is actually a very good legal strategy. The corrected report did not resurrect anyone, but it returned something stolen. Alvarez said Serena's parents could be cleared of the false gang implication. That mattered because lies had followed them into the grave. Serena wanted their names returned to ordinary innocence. Dante's full admission landed without excuse. Dante admitted. He ordered the chase and let lawyers hide his family's name. He promised to cooperate whether Serena forgave him or not. For the first time, his apology did not ask anything from her. Nico's hospital room became the place where blame and loyalty sat in the same chair. Nico survived, but pain made him pale and angry at his own weakness. Dante blamed himself until Serena told him guilt was not a plan. Mercy became severe because it demanded action. Dante said he loved Serena before either of them was ready for the words. Dante said he loved Serena before either of them was ready. She told him gratitude was not love, and she would not answer on command. He accepted waiting as the first honest proof of the words. The legal unraveling began with files, names and men who suddenly wanted silence. Dante hired real attorneys and gave investigators records from Franco's network. He refused to trade poor boys for his own freedom. Serena made him aim upward at the men who had profited most. The first betrayal came from men who had once bowed to Dante's shadow. Former allies called Dante weak, and one tried to sell information to another crew. Dante wanted to answer with old force and chose testimony instead. Change hurt most when it removed the tools that once made danger simple. In the old harbor office, Dante laid down the ring that had taught him the wrong kind of loyalty. In the old harbor office, Dante removed the Moretti family ring. He handed it to Alvarez beside signed surrender papers. He said power that cost children sleep was rot. The community meetings forced Dante to hear the human cost of his former power. Dante sat through meetings where mothers and shop owners named their losses. He did not defend himself or decorate guilt with charm. Listening became a punishment and a beginning. Danny's therapy taught Serena that rescue was only the first inch of healing. Danny had nightmares, jokes, and questions that arrived without warning. Serena learned not to demand strength when he needed softness. Healing came unevenly, like a stairway built in the dark. Chess gave Danny a battlefield where losing did not mean danger. Dante never let Danny win on purpose. Danny loved that because respect felt different from pity. Their chessboard became a place where fear could shrink into rules. Serena's return to law school felt less like ambition than reclamation. Serena enrolled part-time and refused Dante's offer to pay. She needed to know her feet still belonged to her. Later, she accepted transparent support for a community program. Mira and Luis proved that survival could become action without becoming revenge. Mira helped reopen Bella Vita and Luis trained to become an EMT. Both carried reminders of the night without letting the night own them. Service became one-way pain, found a better direction. The youth meeting turned Dante's shame into a lesson he could not polish. A teenager asked Dante if hurting people had made him feel strong. Dante admitted it had made him empty. He warned the boy to ask who profited when he threw his future away. The kiss came only after silence. work, and the absence of emergency. After Danny spoke publicly about fear, Serena found Dante under a streetlight. He said it was the first room he helped fill, where no one feared him. She kissed him because the work inside his love had become visible. The week after Franco's arrest did not feel like victory. It felt like walking through rooms where the furniture had been moved during a storm. Serena took Danny back to the old apartment because they needed clothes, school books, and the small things that make a life feel continuous. Dante offered to send someone. Serena said no before he finished the sentence. Then she softened. Because she was learning that refusing every offer of help could become its own prison, she told him he could drive them, but he would wait outside unless invited in. Dante accepted without argument. That mattered. In the apartment, the cheap curtains still hung crooked above the sink. The chipped blue mug her mother had loved sat in the cabinet beside two mismatched plates. A stack of overdue notices lay under a magnet shaped like a tomato. Danny opened his closet and stared at the sneakers he had outgrown but refused to throw away. Serena packed slowly. Every drawer held a version of herself that had survived by pretending there was no time to grieve. Dante waited in the hallway, visible through the open door, but not crossing the line. Once, a neighbor peered out and saw him there. Fear flashed across her face. Serena hated that. She hated that Dante could be both the man who had helped save Danny and the man who still made ordinary people lock their doors. That was the problem with change. It did not erase the body memory of everyone who had learned to fear you. When Serena carried the last box out, Dante reached for it, then stopped. He asked, "May I?" She nodded. Danny watched the exchange. Later, in the car, he said, "You ask before helping." Dante glanced at him through the mirror. "Your sister told me help without permission can feel like being handled." Danny considered this. That is actually a good rule. Serena looked out the window so they would not see her eyes fill. 2 days later, the danger reached Mira in a way that made Serena feel sick with guilt. Mira called near midnight, from the bathroom of a pharmacy, 3 blocks from her apartment. Her voice came low and fast. The way people speak when they are afraid someone on the other side of a door can hear breathing. A man had followed her from Bella Vita, not close enough to grab her, close enough to make sure she knew. He wore a gray cap, kept one hand in his pocket, and stopped whenever she stopped. When she ducked into the pharmacy, he waited outside by the newspaper stand. Mira had locked herself in the bathroom and called the police. Then Serena, "I told them what I saw." Mira whispered, "I told them about the man in the pale jacket asking your schedule. Now they know where I live." Serena wanted to say something comforting. Instead, she said the truth. "You did the right thing, and it should not cost you your safety." Dante was beside her when she hung up. His face had hardened into the old expression, the one that made men obey. Serena put a hand on his arm before he reached for his phone. "No punishment patrol," she said. "No private war because my friend got scared." He looked at her, anger still hot in his eyes. He threatened her. "Then we call Alvarez. We get her protected legally. We make her statement stronger, not dirtier." Dante breathed once, twice, then he handed her the phone. "You call him." That was the first time Serena saw him choose the slower road while rage was still fresh. It did not make him harmless. It made him teachable. Mira spent the night at Carmela's insistence in a guest room, with 3 locks and a tray of pastries she was too frightened to eat. The next morning, she gave a formal statement. Her hands shook while she signed. Serena sat beside her. Mira said, "I am not brave like you." Serena answered, "Brave is not a personality. It is what you do while wanting to run." Mira cried then, furious with herself for crying. Serena stayed until the anger passed. Mira's danger did not end with one phone call from a pharmacy bathroom. After Franco's arrest, she returned to Bella Vita to help the police identify the man in the pale jacket, and the restaurant looked different in daylight. Broken glass had been swept into gray piles. Chairs sat upside down on tables. The violinist's abandoned bow had been bagged as evidence. Mira stood near the service entrance, with Detective Alvarez, while an officer showed her still images from security footage. She pointed to Franco, then to Carlo. Then she stopped at a third man she had almost forgotten, a dishwasher hired for one shift who had spent too long near the staff lockers. "Him," she said. Her voice shook. He asked where Serena kept her phone during service. Alvarez asked whether she was certain. Mira wanted to say no because certainty felt dangerous. Instead, she remembered Serena's face when Danny was mentioned, and she said yes. That night, a photo of Mira leaving the police station appeared on her own phone from an unknown number. Beneath it, a message read, "Helpful girls should learn to forget." She did not call Serena first. She called Alvarez. That mattered. Fear had not made her silent. Then she called Serena and cried in a way she would later deny. Serena wanted to run to her, but Alvarez insisted on protective patrols and a safe place. Dante offered one of his houses. Mira refused. "I am not sleeping under Mafia sheets," she said, shaking. Dante heard and nodded. "Fair." He paid for a hotel through Alvarez's office without attaching his name. Mira found out anyway and sent Serena a text. "Tell your terrifying boyfriend adjacent problem that I accept his money but not his vibe." Danny returned to school the following Monday. Because normal life could not be delayed forever. But normal did not mean easy. Rumors had arrived before him. Children had heard pieces from parents, news alerts, and careless adults. By lunch, one boy asked whether Danny's sister was dating a murderer. Another asked if Danny had been kidnapped because his family was secretly criminal. Danny did not hit anyone. That was what the principal said, as if Serena should be grateful for the lowest possible measure of support. She sat across from him in a small office with motivational posters on the wall and asked what the school is intended to do about Tia children, repeating violent rumors about an active investigation. The principal folded his hands. "Kids talk." "Miss Hayes," Serena leaned forward. "Adults teach them what kind of talking becomes acceptable." Dante was waiting outside the school gates, far enough away not to frighten anyone, close enough to see if Serena needed a ride. Danny saw him through the window and looked embarrassed by the relief on his own face. That evening, Danny asked if he could skip school forever and become a marine biologist by reading books at home. Serena almost laughed. She did not. "You can be a marine biologist," she said. "But you still have to learn algebra." Dante, who had been pretending not to listen, said a cruel but legal requirement. Danny smiled for half a second. Then his face collapsed. "They said Mom and Dad were criminals." Serena sat beside him. "They were wrong." "What if the report never changes?" he asked. "It will," she said, "and if it takes time. We keep saying the truth until the paper catches up." Dante stood in the doorway, silent. Later, he told Alvarez to prioritize the corrected report before any public agreement involving his own cooperation. Serena heard about it from Alvarez, not Dante. That made it better. He had done the right thing without presenting it as a gift. Nico and Serena followed Carlo's trail through paperwork because violence, they learned, often entered through boring forms. The temporary security company had an office above a nail salon, a disconnected phone number, and a clerk who kept saying he only handled scheduling. Serena sat beside Nico at a folding table while Alvarez questioned the clerk. She noticed the clerk's left hand tapping each time he lied. "Tap on I never met Carlo. Tap on we verify everyone. Tap on the cameras were broken last week." Law school had taught her rules of evidence. Survival had taught her faces. She wrote the pattern on a napkin and slid it to Alvarez. He changed tactics, asking about payroll instead of Carlo. The clerk broke in 9 minutes. Carlo was not Carlo. The badge belonged to a dead man. Franco's people had bought access to 3 restaurants, 2 apartment buildings, and 1 private school through the same fake company. When Serena heard private school, her mind went straight to Danny. Alvarez saw her face and said the school had already been notified. Dante, standing near the window, had not moved, but one knuckle had split where his fist pressed too hard into the wall. Serena looked at the blood, then at him. "Do not make me manage your rage too," she said quietly. He opened his hand. "I know, good." Nico, pale from his injury, muttered, "That counts as growth in this family." Nobody laughed, but the comment kept the room from drowning. The first time Dante faced his old crew after deciding to cooperate, Serena was not there. She only heard the story later from Nico, who told it with his usual dry humor, because fear embarrassed him. 3 men waited outside a closed warehouse, where Dante had once controlled shipments that were never described honestly on paper. They were not enemies exactly. That made them more dangerous. They were men who had eaten at Dante's table, taken his money, and praised his ruthlessness when it benefited them. One called him soft. Another said the city would devour a boss who mistook guilt for morality. The third, Marco, stepped close enough that Nico reached under his jacket. Dante raised one hand to stop him. Marco spat near Dante's shoes and said, "Your father would be ashamed." Dante did not answer at first. He looked at the warehouse, the trucks, the locked office where cash had once moved without receipts. Then he said, "My father taught me how to win rooms full of frightened men. He did not teach me how to sleep." Marco laughed and reached for his gun. Dante could have been faster. Nico certainly could have been. Instead, Dante stepped aside, let Marco draw, and allowed the federal agents waiting inside a surveillance van to move in. It was humiliating, controlled, and legal. That was why it mattered. No blood on the pavement. No midnight revenge. No lesson taught through fear. When Serena heard, she felt a strange ache. Part of her had wanted Dante to remain powerful enough that nothing could touch him. Another part knew that untouchable men were the reason people like her had been hurt. That night, Dante came to the community center with a split lip and paperwork. Danny asked if he won. Dante said, "Not the way I used to." Danny nodded. "Probably healthier." Nico, standing behind him, muttered, "Less satisfying." Serena laughed despite herself. Marco's betrayal came 2 weeks later, and it proved that leaving violence could be more dangerous than ruling it. Marco had once been one of Dante's most loyal captains, a broad man with a soft voice and hands that never stopped moving. He sent Dante a message asking for a private meeting at the old warehouse. Nico said no. Dante agreed anyway, but he brought Alvarez's team without telling Marco. Serena learned later and was furious, because without telling had become a phrase she refused to accept casually. At the warehouse, Marco did not come to negotiate. He came to record Dante saying something that could destroy the cooperation agreement. He spoke of loyalty, fathers, blood, and shame. He called Dante a prince begging schoolteachers for absolution. He said men would die because Dante had forgotten how to be feared. Dante listened until Marco mentioned Danny. Then the old Dante stepped forward so quickly even Nico's hand moved toward his weapon. Dante stopped himself inches away. That was the whole battle. Not the men in the shadows. Not the recorder in Marco's pocket. The battle was the inch he did not cross. "Threaten a child again," Dante said quietly, "and I will still not become useful to your version of me." Alvarez's officers moved in. Marco reached for a gun and was taken down before he cleared the holster. Later, Serena watched the recording. She saw Dante's restraint, and it frightened her more than rage would have because she understood how much it had cost him. The victims' meeting was harder than the warehouse. It took place in a municipal room with folding chairs, bad coffee, and a long table where Dante sat without bodyguards. Serena had not intended to attend. Alvarez asked her because the fund structure involved legal aid, and because some of the victims wanted to see whether Dante would bring the woman he had saved as proof that he had become good. Serena nearly refused for that reason alone. She would not be used as his character witness. Dante agreed before she said it. "You do not speak for me," he told her. "You speak if you have something of your own to say." The first shop owner was a thin man with shaking hands. He described 12 years of payments disguised as security fees. He described his wife hiding money in flour tins, his son leaving the city because he was tired of watching his father bow to younger men with guns. The man looked directly at Dante and said, "I hope your guilt keeps you awake." Dante answered, "It does." The man said, "Good, that is not forgiveness." Dante nodded. "I know." Serena watched him refuse to rescue himself with explanations. That was accountability in its least glamorous form. Sitting still, listening, not turning pain into a debate. When her turn came, Serena spoke not as Dante's lover, and not as a victim asking everyone to be merciful. She spoke about corrected reports, legal representation, trauma counseling, and children who inherit fear from systems they never entered. Her voice shook only once. Afterward, an older woman stopped her in the hallway and said, "Do not let love make you blind." Serena answered, "I won't." The woman studied her, then said, "Good, make him work." The victims' meeting changed Dante more than the gunfight had. One woman arrived with a photograph of her brother, who had disappeared, Sofia, after refusing to pay one of Franco's collectors, working through a Moretti-controlled route. The case was not clean. Dante had not ordered the disappearance. Franco's people had carried it out. But the route existed because Dante's money, trucks, and silence had made it convenient. The woman placed the photograph face up on the table and slid it toward him. "Do not tell me you are sorry," she said. "Sorry is what people say when they want the room to let them breathe." Dante looked at the photograph. The brother was 27, smiling beside a grill, one arm around a dog. Dante did not reach for excuses. "What do you want me to know?" he asked. The woman seemed angrier because the question was decent. "He sang badly. He made pancakes for my daughters. He was afraid of hospitals. He should not be a lesson in your redemption story." Serena felt that sentence land in her own chest. Dante nodded. "He won't be." The woman laughed once. "Bitter. You cannot promise that." "No," Dante said. "I can promise to remember that he belongs to you, not to the story people tell about me." Afterward, Serena found him in the stairwell, both hands gripping the rail. He did not ask her to comfort him. She did not. She stood beside him until his breathing slowed, because sometimes Heaven's mercy meant not letting a person escape the weight they had finally agreed to carry. The ring came later, in the old Moretti office above the harbor. The room seemed built to make men feel permanent. Dark wood, heavy curtains, a view of the docks, photographs of fathers, uncles and sons who had mistaken inheritance for destiny. Dante stood behind the desk where his father had once sat, and for a moment Serena saw the boy he must have been. Learning that tenderness was weakness, and obedience, Alvarez waited near the wall with 2 federal attorneys. Nico stood by the window, one hand braced against his healing side. On the desk lay property transfers, cooperation agreements, and a list of assets to be liquidated for the victim's fund. Dante removed the family ring from his hand. He did it slowly, not theatrically. The pale band of skin beneath it looked almost indecent. "My father told me this meant loyalty," he said. "Maybe it did once. Or maybe that was another story men told themselves, so their sons would inherit their sins with better posture." No one spoke. Dante placed the ring on the desk and slid it toward Alvarez. If power cost children their sleep, then it was never power. It was rot. Serena felt those words enter the room like fresh air through a cracked wall. They did not purify the past. They did not bring back her parents. But they marked a line. Nico looked away first. Later, in the elevator, he said, "Your father would have hated that speech." Dante looked at the closed doors. "I know," Nico nodded. "Good speech, then." It was the closest he came to crying. There was one more private cost Dante paid that Serena did not understand until she saw it. He sold the seaside villa, the house where Danny had been taken, where Serena had found the Harbor Road folder, where terror and tenderness had both entered, through different doors, was placed into the restitution fund. Dante signed the sale papers without ceremony. Afterward, he walked through the empty rooms alone, then asked Serena to join him in the library. The chessboard was still there. Danny had left a note beneath a pawn. "Do not cheat against yourself." Dante read it twice. "He is becoming dangerous with metaphors," he said. Serena touched the back of a chair. "Are you okay?" "No." He looked around at the shelves, the balcony doors, the place where the red laser had crossed the wall. "This was the safest house I knew how to build, and it was not safe." Serena stepped beside him, then let it become something else. The buyer, through Alvarez's arrangement, turned the property into a retreat for families of witnesses waiting for trial. Months later, the first children arrived with backpacks and nervous faces. The house did not become innocent. Houses do not do that. But it became useful. Dante stood at the gate and watched from a distance. Not entering, Serena stood beside him. Neither spoke. Some transformations deserved quiet. Healing after the public danger ended was quieter and more stubborn than anyone expected. Danny still woke up night since he was in the service hallway at the villa. He would sit on the floor counting locks under his breath, apologizing for being too loud, apologizing for opening the door, apologizing for making Serena come after him. The first time Dante heard it, he looked as if someone had placed a weapon in his hands and ordered him not to use it. Serena saw the old instinct rise in him. Fix it, command it, remove it. She shook her head before he spoke. Instead, Dante sat on the floor outside Danny's door and said through the wood, "You do not have to open. I am here if you want another voice." For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, Danny whispered, "Tell me something boring." Dante considered. "The import tax code is very boring." Danny sniffed. "Tell me that." So Dante did. He explained tariffs, shipping manifests, and customs categories, until Danny laughed weakly and told him he was the worst storyteller in history. Serena stood in the hallway with one hand over her mouth. That night taught Dante more than any lecture could have. Comfort did not always enter the room. Sometimes it waited outside and talked about paperwork until fear loosened its grip. Danny's healing also involved anger, which adults liked less than sadness. Sadness made people sympathetic. Anger made them nervous. One afternoon he threw the chessboard across the library after losing to Dante for the 5th time. Pieces hit the wall and scattered under chairs. Carmela gasped from the hallway. Serena stepped forward, but Dante lifted one hand, asking her to wait. He did not raise his voice. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. Danny's face crumpled. "I want everyone to stop looking at me like I am breakable." Dante nodded. "I can do that." "No, you can't. You all do it." Serena asks if I am okay every 6 minutes. "You talk like doors have feelings." Nico keeps giving me knives made of words like situational awareness. Despite herself, Serena almost laughed at the last one. Danny wiped his face angrily. "I was stupid. I opened the door." Dante knelt. Not dramatically, just to pick up a pawn. "You were tricked by adults who built a trap for a child." "Same thing." "No." Dante set the pawn on the table. A trap works because the trapper is responsible for making normal things dangerous. Your sister's voice should have been safe. That is why he stole it. Danny stared at him. I still hate myself for it. Serena's throat closed. Dante said, then hate will have to sit with us until it gets tired. We will not obey it. That was the sentence Danny later repeated to his therapist. Not because it fixed him, because it gave him a place to put what did not yet know how to leave. Nico's healing became its own small drama because he hated being cared for. He returned to work too early, lied about pain, and tried to intimidate his physical therapist by staring. The therapist, a woman named Grace who had raised 3 sons and feared no man with tattoos, told him she charged extra for dramatic silence. Carmela loved her immediately. Danny made Nico a progress chart shaped like a video game level. Each completed exercise earned him a sticker. Nico said he would rather be shot again. Danny said that could be arranged emotionally if Nico skipped therapy. Dante laughed for the first time in days. Beneath the teasing was something tender. Nico had taken a bullet because loyalty, at its best, was not obedience to power but protection of life. He and Serena became unlikely friends after she visited, with soup and legal forms for his medical leave. You organize affection like a court filing, Nico told her. You hide affection like evidence, she replied. He considered that and nodded. Fair. Months later, at the community center, Nico taught a workshop on reading exits without living in fear. His main rule was simple. Awareness should make you freer, not smaller. Serena wrote it on the board and kept it there for weeks. Serena's return to law school was not triumphant. It was awkward. She was older than many students, tired in a way expensive coffee could not solve, and carrying a notebook with Danny's therapy schedule, tucked between evidence rules and civil procedure. On the first day, the professor discussed witness credibility. Serena felt Harbor Road rise inside her chest. A missing statement, a paid officer, a dead couple reduced to a misleading phrase. Her hands went cold. For 1 minute, she considered leaving. Then she imagined Franco smiling whenever silence protected him. She stayed. After class, a young student recognized her from the news and asked whether it was true she had shot a man. Serena looked at the girl and said, "It is true that I protected my brother during a kidnapping." The girl flushed. "Sorry." Serena nodded. "Be careful with other people's worst days. You rarely know where the sentence should begin." That became a rule, she repeated later at the community center. Stories could harm when told carelessly. They could also heal when told with responsibility. Law, she was beginning to understand, was not only argument, it was memory with structure. It was the difference between a rumor and a record. Alvarez became the kind of ally Serena trusted because he never pretended the system was cleaner than it was. One evening he met her at the community center with 2 boxes of files and a warning. "There are good people in bad institutions," he said, setting the boxes down. "There are also bad people who learn to sound procedural. Learn the difference." Serena opened the first box and saw copies of old witness reports, chain of custody logs, and disciplinary records from officers connected to Harbor Road. Her law student mind woke like a muscle remembering itself. Alvarez did not give her confidential material she could not have, but he showed her how public records could be requested, compared, and used. "Truth often hides in dates," he said. Who signed what? Who was on shift? Which camera was suddenly under repair? Who transferred 2 weeks later? Serena thought of every poor family that had accepted an official sentence because they lacked the language to challenge it. That night shaped the legal rights workshops she later built. She taught people to write down badge numbers, keep copies, ask for receipts, photograph injuries, and bring a second person to important meetings. It was not glamorous. It was not dramatic. It was power in paper form. Dante watched one workshop from the back and said afterward, "You are teaching them to survive men like me." Serena corrected him. "I am teaching them to survive systems that depended on men like you." He nodded. "Better? Yes," she said. "Better matters." Franco, even in custody, tried to remain present. He sent no direct message after his arrest. But his lawyer filed motions that used Serena's name too often and Danny's age too casually. One motion suggested that Dante had manipulated a traumatized woman into giving statements. Another implied that Danny's memory of the kidnapping was unreliable because of stress. Serena read the pages at Alvarez's desk and felt the old desire to break something rise in her hands. Alvarez slid a pen toward her. "Use this instead." She marked every line where the language tried to turn harm into fog. She wrote notes in the margin. Victim blaming, improper speculation, irrelevant character framing, child witness intimidation by implication. Dante arrived halfway through and stood behind her, reading silently. "I can have my attorney respond," he said. Serena did not look up. "My name is on the page. I will understand the response too." He pulled a chair beside her instead of taking over. For 3 hours they worked across the same table, not as protector and protected, but as two people facing a document designed to make truth tired. At midnight, Danny woke on the station couch and mumbled, "Are we winning?" Serena looked at the marked pages, at Dante's tired face, at Alvarez refilling terrible coffee. "We are not letting them write us badly," she said. "That is a kind of winning." At the community center, Dante learned to be useful without being impressive. That may have been the hardest discipline of all. He stacked folding chairs after workshops. He carried boxes of donated notebooks. He served pasta from aluminum trays, while teenagers made jokes about his expensive shoes. One boy with a split lip asked why a rich man was doing janitor work. Dante said, "Some debts are paid by learning to be useful." The boy asked whether Dante had ever hurt people. The room went quiet. Serena looked at Dante and did not rescue him. He did not rescue himself either. "Yes," he said. "Did it make you feel strong?" the boy asked. Dante looked down at the chair in his hands for a short time. "Then it made me empty. The emptiness made me do worse things so I would not feel it. That is how violence lies." The boy stared at him. "So what do I do when someone disrespects me?" Dante answered carefully. "Ask who profits if you throw away your future for their reaction." The boy did not smile, but he stayed after the meeting to eat. Serena counted that as more important than applause. Later, Dante washed dishes while wearing one of Carmela's aprons. Danny took a picture. Nico threatened to frame it. Serena's own test came at the legal aid clinic when a teenage girl named Rosa arrived with bruises hidden under makeup and a story she kept changing. Rosa was 16, sharp, defensive, and furious at anyone who sounded gentle. Her older brother had been running errands for men connected to Franco's network, and now a debt collector was threatening their mother. Serena wanted to give advice too quickly. She heard herself becoming the kind of adult who compresses another person's fear into a plan, so she stopped. She asked Rosa what she wanted most in the next hour. Not next month. Not in court. The next hour. Rosa said she wanted her little sister picked up from school by someone safe. That was where they began. 1 hour, 1 pickup, 1 safe room. Dante arranged a car through Alvarez, not through his old men. Serena noticed the difference and wrote it into the program rules later. Help must not make the helped person indebted to private power. Help had to move through accountable channels whenever possible. Rosa returned 3 days later with her sister and a backpack full of documents. She did not thank Serena. She sat down and said, "Okay, what now?" Serena smiled. Trust often entered a room disguised as impatience. The last addition to Serena's program came from a boy named Malik, who attended 3 workshops without saying anything. He wore the same red hoodie every time, and sat near the door with 1 foot angled toward escape. On the 4th week, he stayed after everyone left and asked whether a person could be both a victim and someone who had hurt people. Serena thought of Dante, but she did not say his name. "Yes," she said, "that is why simple labels can fail us. But harm still needs accountability." Malik stared at the floor. He had carried packages for men near the docks. He had not known what was inside at first. Then he knew and kept doing it because his younger brothers needed food. Serena did not absolve him. She did not condemn him into silence either. She called Alvarez, found a youth legal advocate, and sat with Malik until his aunt arrived. Dante was stacking chairs in the hallway and heard only pieces. Later, he said, "That boy could have been recruited by me 10 years ago." Serena answered, "Then help make sure the next version of him has another door." Dante paid for the program's evening meals after that, but the checks went through a board, with receipts and votes and minutes. He complained that accountability had more paperwork than crime. Serena said that was one of its advantages. The first kiss happened only after months of almost that remained almosts, because Serena refused to let danger speed up intimacy. Dante never pushed. Sometimes that restraint was tender. Sometimes it was visibly difficult. Once, after a long meeting with attorneys, Serena found him outside under the rain, hands in his pockets, looking up at the community center sign. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Waiting until I am not angry," he said. "At who?" "Everyone, myself first." She stood beside him. They watched water run down the sign in crooked lines. He said, "I used to think anger required motion. It often requires supervision," she answered. He laughed. It broke the heaviness just enough. Weeks later, after Danny gave his speech about bravery, meaning admitting when you are not okay, Serena walked outside and saw Dante staring at the building, with wet eyes he pretended were caused by wind. She took his hand. He looked down as if the simple touch was more than he deserved. "Do not ruin this with a speech," she said. "I was not going to." "You were. Maybe a small one." "No." Then she kissed him. It was not a reward. It was not forgiveness made physical. It was a beginning that had waited until truth could stand beside it. Serena and Dante almost broke during a quiet dinner. Not during a shootout. That surprised her. Carmela had made pasta. Danny had fallen asleep early. And for once the villa felt less like a bunker. Dante received a call from an attorney and stepped outside. When he returned, he said the matter was handled. Serena's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Handled how? He paused. Legally, that is not an answer. Fatigue crossed his face. "Serena, it is late." The words were ordinary. The tone was not. It was the tone of a man used to ending questions. Serena stood. "Do not do that." Dante closed his eyes. "I know. No. You reacted before you knew. That is the problem." He put both palms on the table and lowered his head. For a second she saw how tired he was of learning in front of her. Then he looked up and said, "The attorney found another shell company tied to Franco. I authorized disclosure to Alvarez. I did not tell you because part of me still thinks sparing you details is kindness. It isn't. I know. Say the harder thing." Dante swallowed. "Part of me also wanted one decision that did not have to pass through your eyes first." Serena felt that land. It was honest. Not pretty, but honest. "You can have privacy," she said. "You cannot have secrecy about things that touch my family." He nodded. Understood. They finished dinner cold, but they finished it at the same table. That mattered more than a beautiful apology. When Serena finally told Dante she loved him, it did not happen on the beach or under a perfect moon. It happened in the hallway outside Danny's therapist's office, beside a vending machine that refused to release a bag of pretzels. Dante had just spent 40 minutes in a family session listening to Danny explain that he liked him, but still sometimes imagined his hands ordering the chase on Harbor Road. Dante had accepted it without flinching. Afterward, while Danny argued with the vending machine, Dante stood very still, as if surviving the session required all his muscles. Serena asked if he was all right. He said, "No, but I am staying." There was no performance in it. No tragic beauty, just a man choosing not to escape a child's honest pain. Serena felt the last locked part of herself open. Not wide, not without fear, but enough. "I love you," she said. Dante turned as if he had misheard. The pretzel bag dropped at that exact moment, and Danny shouted victory. Dante looked from Serena to the vending machine and back again. "Did you just say that next to processed snacks?" he asked, voice breaking. Serena smiled. "Do not make me regret it." He laughed with wet eyes. "Never." Danny held up the pretzels. "I feel like I'm some emotionally important." Serena kissed Dante's cheek. "You did," Danny groaned. "Good, I prefer snacks." By the time spring returned, their lives had not become simple, but they had become honest enough to breathe inside. Serena still corrected Dante when protection turned into management. He'd caught himself too late sometimes and apologized without making a ceremony of it. Danny planted basil in a cracked pot at the community center, because Carmela said every kitchen needed something green. The plant survived bad soil, irregular watering, and one accidental soccer ball. Danny declared it a symbol of resilience. Serena teased him for sounding like a motivational poster. Later, when they adopted a scruffy rescue dog, Danny named him Basil because, as he explained, everything that survives in this family deserves respect. Dante looked at Serena when he said it. She looked away before she cried. Mira ran Bella Vita with terrifying efficiency. Luis trained as an EMT and returned monthly to teach first aid. Nico limped less and complained more, which everyone agreed meant he was healing. Nothing erased the past. The corrected report did not bring back Serena's parents. The victims' fund did not make Dante innocent. Therapy did not make Danny forget. But the work created rooms where truth could stay, without swallowing everyone alive. That was enough to keep building. The public hearing came on a rainy Thursday, which felt cruelly appropriate to Serena. The courthouse windows blurred with water, and every umbrella in the lobby dripped onto the tile until the plates smelled like wet wool and old paper. Dante sat at the front beside his attorney, not in a tailored black suit meant to intimidate, but in a plain dark one that made him look younger and more tired. Serena sat 3 rows behind him with Danny, Mira, Luis, Carmela, and Nico. She had asked Dante whether he wanted her beside him. He had said yes. Then he had asked whether being there would cost her too much. That question was the reason she came. The hearing was not a trial for every sin Dante had committed. It was a public review of cooperation agreements, restitution structures, and corrected records tied to several investigations. including Harbor Road. The language was dry. The feelings were not. A woman whose brother had been beaten by one of Dante's former collectors spoke first. Her voice did not shake. She said she did not care how many papers Dante signed, because her brother still flinched when men laughed behind him. Dante listened with both hands flat on the table. He did not look away. When allowed to respond, he said, "You are right to be angry. My cooperation does not purchase your forgiveness. It gives the state information it should have had sooner, and it gives me a chance to stop protecting the system that harmed your family. That is all." The judge watched him carefully. Serena watched the woman. The woman did not soften. That was her right. Serena wanted to protect Dante from the cruelty of the room, and knew that wanting was dangerous. Accountability had to be allowed to hurt. The public hearing was harder because it made private pain official. Serena watched lawyers reduce terror into paragraphs. But she also watched the record change under the pressure of evidence. Harbor Road was spoken aloud. Evelyn Hayes, Thomas Hayes, innocent victims, corrected timeline, missing witness, suppressed statement, no involvement in criminal activity. Danny held her hand so tightly her fingers ached. The old phrase, gang-related traffic violence, did not vanish from every article ever written, but it lost its authority in the room that day. When reporters crowded the courthouse steps, one asked Serena if she forgave Dante now that he had helped expose the truth. She took the microphone, because silence would let someone else frame the answer. "Forgiveness is not a receipt," she said. "You do not earn it by producing one useful document. Today is about my parents being named correctly. It is about my brother hearing that they were innocent. It is about systems that let powerful men bury facts. Do not turn that into a romance headline." The reporters went quiet for half a second. That half second felt like a small legal victory. Dante stood behind her, not beside her. He did not touch her shoulder for the cameras. He did not lower his head in a performance of shame. He let her words stand without trying to share them. When Harbor Road came up, Serena felt Danny's hand search for hers. Alvarez presented the corrected timeline, Franco's driver, the forced lane, the missing witness statement, the payments that buried it, the pressure from both criminal networks to keep the larger conflict out of the official record. The phrase gang-related traffic violence was formally challenged as misleading. Serena heard her parents' names spoken clearly in a room, with a court reporter taking them down. Evelyn Hayes, Thomas Hayes, innocent victims, not suspects, not rumors, not collateral described in lazy language. Danny began to cry silently. Serena did too. Dante did not turn around, though she knew he wanted to. That restraint mattered. This was not his moment to share. It belonged to the dead and to the children they left behind. After the hearing, reporters gathered outside. Questions came like thrown stones. Was Serena in love with Dante? Did she forgive him? Was he a hero now? Serena stepped to the microphones because silence had protected too many wrong people already. "My parents were innocent," she said. "My brother was a child when they died, and he is still a child now. Do not turn our family into entertainment for men who want redemption without responsibility. Mr. Moretti helped save my brother. He also benefited from a world that helped destroy my family. Both things are true. The question now is not whether we can make a clean story. We cannot. The question is whether the truth will finally be useful." She walked away before anyone could turn her answer into a romance headline. The day after the hearing, Serena visited her parents' graves without Dante. She needed one place where his remorse did not enter the frame. The cemetery sat behind a stone church at the edge of the city, under trees that dropped yellow leaves across the paths. Serena brought grocery store flowers because the florist near the bus stop had closed early. She felt guilty for that, then angry at herself for believing grief required better flowers. Danny came with her but stayed near the car, tossing pebbles at a puddle and pretending he did not need distance. Serena knelt between the two headstones and told her parents what the corrected report said. She spoke their names the way Alvarez had spoken them in court. Evelyn, Thomas, innocent. She told them Danny was taller now, that he still hated peas, that he had survived something terrible and was learning not to blame himself. Then she told them about Dante, not because she owed the dead a confession, but because hiding him from that grass and stone felt childish. "He helped us," she said. "He also helped create what took you. I do not know how to hold those truths without dropping one." The wind moved through the trees. No answer came. Maybe maturity was realizing that the dead do not absolve the living. Danny finally walked over and placed one pebble on each headstone. "I think you would be proud of Serena," he said. Then, after a pause, and maybe mad at her for not sleeping, Serena laughed and cried at the same time. That was grief too. two feelings refusing to wait their turn. Dante's absence from that cemetery was a choice Serena had asked for, and he honored it even though it hurt him. He spent the same hour with Carmela in the villa kitchen, learning how to make the soup Danny liked after therapy. Carmela watched him cut carrots too slowly and told him guilt had not improved his knife skills. Dante accepted the insult with dignity. Carmela had served the Moretti family since Dante was a boy, but she had never mistaken employment for blindness. "Your mother would be relieved," she said without looking at him. Dante's hand stilled. "That I am cooking, that you are listening." He resumed cutting. "I did not listen to her enough. No son does while there is still time." Carmela took the knife from him and corrected his grip. "Do not make the girl your priest." Dante looked toward the window. "I am trying not to. Try harder. Women are tired." That startled a laugh out of him. Carmela pointed the knife at his chest. "I am serious. If your change requires Serena to stand there every day confirming it, then it is only another job you have given her." Dante heard the truth in that more sharply than any legal document. That night, when Serena returned from the cemetery, he did not ask whether she had spoken about him. He simply placed soup in front of Danny and said, "Carmela saved you from my first attempt." Danny tasted it and said, "This still seems like a crime." Carmela shouted from the kitchen, "It is better than his father's." Dante smiled, but Serena saw the lesson had reached him. That night, Dante found Serena in the community center kitchen after everyone else had gone. She was washing mugs that were already clean because her hands needed something to do. He stood at the doorway. "May I come in?" She nodded. He entered and leaned against the counter, leaving space between them. For a while, the only sound was water. "You defended the truth today," he said. "Not me." "I know." "Good." She turned off the faucet. "Part of me wanted to defend you." His eyes lowered. "That part scares me." "It scares me too," she admitted. "Because love can make people edit reality. I refuse to do that." Dante looked at her with grief and relief mixed together. "Do not edit it for me. I won't, even if I ask. Especially then." He smiled faintly, but it did not last. "I keep thinking there will be a final punishment that makes the scale balance." Serena dried her hands slowly. "There won't be. No, there will be choices. A lot of them. Boring ones. Public ones. Private ones. Choices where nobody thanks you. Choices where people still hate you afterward." That sounds like a sentence. Maybe it is. He accepted that. Then Danny appeared in the doorway with Basil the dog under one arm. Months before the Italy trip, and only weeks after they had adopted him, the dog had knocked over a box of donated crayons and looked proud of the crime. Danny said, "Basil chose chaos." Serena laughed so hard she had to sit down. Dante laughed too, carefully at first. Then, for real, for 1 minute. Accountability, grief, and fear all had to share the kitchen with a guilty dog covered in blue crayon dust. It was not healing in the dramatic sense. It was better. It was life returning without asking permission. One smaller scene stayed with Serena, more than the microphones or the legal language. A week after the hearing, she found Danny teaching the Dante how to fold paper boats at the community center. Rain tapped the windows. Basil slept under a table. Dante's boat kept collapsing because his hands were too large and too impatient. Danny sighed with the authority of a tired professor and said, "You cannot force the fold. You have to line it up first." Dante looked at Serena, and she knew he had heard the lesson beneath the craft. He tried again, slower. The paper held. Danny placed both boats in a plastic tub and made waves with his fingers. For once, nobody mentioned guns, reports, or danger. The boats bumped, drifted apart, and came together again. Serena thought about how children heal in pieces adults might miss. A joke, a craft, a night without apology, a man learning to be gentle with paper because a boy asked him to. She kept that image for the days when progress felt too small to trust. Later, she would remember the paper boats. Whenever someone asked whether broken people could still learn again. The hardest conversation between Serena and Danny happened after a good day. That was unfair but true. He had passed a math test, played basketball after school, eaten too much pizza, and laughed at Basil until milk came out of his nose. Then, while brushing his teeth, he suddenly asked whether their parents had suffered. Serena stood in the bathroom doorway, with a towel in her hands, and felt every easy answer die before reaching her mouth. Children can smell lies when fear sharpens them. She sat on the edge of the tub. "I do not know all of it," she said. "I know the crash was fast. I know they loved us. I know their last day had ordinary things in it. Not just the ending." Danny spit toothpaste into the sink and wiped his mouth. "What if I forget their voices? Then we will borrow memory from each other. What if you forget too? Then we will be sad and still love them. He leaned against the counter. I remember Dad singing wrong on purpose. Serena smiled. It was not on purpose. He was just terrible. Danny laughed, then cried so suddenly it scared them both. Serena held him on the bathroom floor. Dante passed the hallway, saw them, and kept walking. That was another kind of love, knowing the room was not yours. Mira's role in the new Bella Vita became more than survival. She insisted the restaurant install real cameras, panic buttons near the service station, and a policy that any staff member could refuse a table for harassment without losing tips. The owner complained about cost until Mira placed a newspaper photo of the shattered dining room on his desk and asked how much another funeral would cost. After that, the budget appeared. Serena attended the first staff training because Mira asked her to speak. She stood in front of servers, dishwashers, hosts, cooks, and managers who looked at her with the nervous respect people give someone whose trauma has become public. She hated that look, so she began with something practical. If someone makes you uncomfortable, you do not need a perfect explanation before you tell someone. Patterns matter. Weird questions matter. A customer asking for schedules is not flirting. A stranger waiting by the staff door is not nothing. Mira crossed her arms and nodded hard enough to frighten two hosts. Luis demonstrated how to pack a wound using towels because restaurants always had towels. People laughed awkwardly, then listened. Afterward, a dishwasher approached Mira and admitted a delivery driver had been asking which employees left alone after closing. This time, nobody laughed. They wrote it down. They called Alvarez. Danger lost one doorway that night. The final weeks before the Italian trip were full of small choices that would not make headlines, and therefore mattered more. Serena submitted a law school paper on witness intimidation and used no names from her own life. Danny attended a school science night and stood beside a poster about tide pools, while pretending not to look for exits. Mira changed the employee entrance policy at Bella Vita and fired a man for laughing when a waitress said a customer made her uncomfortable. Luis failed his first ambulance driving test because he took a turn too cautiously, then passed the second time and brought cannoli to celebrate. Nico learned physical therapy was not a conspiracy designed to humiliate him, though he remained suspicious. Dante opened a legitimate import office with glass walls, public records, and a receptionist who asked everyone, including him, to sign in. The first time Serena saw him write his own name in the visitor log, she smiled. "How does accountability feel?" she asked. "Like bad lighting," he said, "but survivable." These were not dramatic victories. They were better. They were habits forming where fear used to live. 3 nights before the Italian trip, Serena found herself back at the old apartment with a cardboard box, a roll of tape, and a courage that felt embarrassingly ordinary. She had come to sort the last drawers. Danny claimed he did not care what happened to the place, then spent 20 minutes deciding whether a cracked plastic planet from his childhood mobile should be saved. Serena kept it. In the bottom drawer of her mother's sewing table, she found a grocery list written 2 days before the crash. Milk, basil, batteries. Pick up Danny's library card. The handwriting nearly folded her in half. She sat on the floor until the room stopped tilting. Dante waited in the hallway because she had asked him to. When she finally opened the door, he did not ask whether she was okay. He had learned better. He simply held out an empty box. That same week, the final court preparation brought one last ugly surprise. Franco's lawyer tried to introduce a rumor that Serena's father had once done accounting work for a Moretti-connected shipping firm. The claim was thin, but it landed like a hook. Alvarez warned Serena before the filing became public. "This may be nothing," he said, "or it may be someone trying to dirty the waters before the corrected report goes through." Serena sat with the document all night. Dante did not touch it until she pushed it toward him. "Read it," she said. He read every line. His face changed at one company name. "I know that firm." Serena felt the room tighten. "How?" "My father used it before I was old enough to understand what clean books were supposed to look like." He did not soften it. He did not reach for her hand. "I do not know whether your father was involved. I will not guess. I will help find the paper trail." That answer did not comfort her. It steadied her, which was more useful. 2 mornings later, Alvarez brought Serena a second folder and warned her not to read it standing up. The folder contained photographs of Mira's building entrance, Danny's school gate, and the loading door behind Bella Vita. Franco's people had marked times beside each image. Not plans exactly, but habits. Serena stared at the notes and understood why fear had felt so intelligent. It had studied routine until love looked predictable. Dante read the folder only after she pushed it across the table. His first expression was rage. His second was discipline. He called Alvarez, not his old men. He requested protective orders, camera copies, and legal warrants instead of revenge. Serena heard the difference. Mira did too when officers walked her home that night. "Tell Dante I still reject his vibe," she said, "but this version is less terrible." Serena laughed because terror had not stolen Mira's timing, and that felt like its own small victory for every one of them. Mira, meanwhile, turned Bella Vita into a place that refused to be useful to predators again. She bullied the new owner into installing cameras that actually worked, panic buttons near the kitchen, brighter alley lights, and a rule that no temporary worker entered without 2 forms of verified identification. When the owner complained about cost, Mira placed a photograph of the ruined dining room on his desk and said, "This is what cheap security buys." Luis, still limping, came by after EMT training and taught the staff how to apply pressure to a wound. Nobody joked during that lesson. Even the dishwasher listened with both hands still. Serena watched Mira lock the back door afterward and felt a fierce pride. Mira had been frightened. She had also changed the room. Danny's school hallway taught a quieter lesson. Rumors did not vanish because adults corrected a file. One boy whispered that Danny's sister loved a murderer. Danny did not hit him. He walked to the counselor's office and asked for Serena. That choice mattered more than a perfect response. When Dante heard, he did not offer to scare anyone. He asked whether Danny wanted him at dinner or wanted space. Danny, after much theatrical thinking, said, "Dinner," but no intense Mafia face. Dante practiced a blank expression. Danny rated it 3 out of 10, for the first time in days. Serena laughed without feeling guilty. At the community center, those small lessons became policy. Serena added workshops on school rumors, witness intimidation, safe reporting, and how to ask for help without giving up control. Dante stacked chairs in the back and accepted that nobody owed him admiration for doing the least glamorous work in the room. Nico let Danny decorate his cane with star stickers after a long argument he pretended to lose. Carmela brought too much food. Rosa returned with her little sister. Malik brought his aunt. The program did not look like redemption in the dramatic sense. It looked like sign-in sheets, hot trays, ride lists, emergency contacts, and people learning that safety could be organized. Serena liked that better. It meant healing did not depend on one powerful man. It belonged to everyone who kept showing up. The Italian village was not an escape from the past. Serena knew that before they arrived. It was a pause with salt air, narrow streets, lemon trees, and enough distance for Danny to sleep with the window open. Dante had chosen the place because his mother had once brought him there before his father taught him that peace was for people who could afford weakness. He had not returned since he was 15. On their first morning, he stood outside a bakery and stared at a blue door across the square. Serena asked what he saw. "My mother buying bread," he said. "My father waiting in the car because he thought standing in line made him ordinary. And you." "I wanted to be ordinary enough to choose the pastry." Serena took his hand after a pause. "Choose one now." He looked at her, then at the window. He bought 6. Danny ate 2 and declared Italy emotionally advanced. For a few days, the world became meals, walks, bad translations, Basil chasing gulls, and Dante learning that rest did not have to be earned through suffering first. Then Alvarez's message came, and peace proved it had never been the same thing as ignorance. A year later, the Italian village offered peace, without pretending history had vanished. Peace did not arrive like sunlight, but like a burned house rebuilt board by board. Dante lost money, property, allies, and reputation. Serena respected that change cost him something real. The village itself gave them room to breathe without asking them to forget. A year later they stood in an Italian seaside village with Danny and a rescue dog. Laundry moved above them, and the harbor turned gold. The life was not perfect, which made it more believable. The crab under the rock gave Danny a harmless mystery to argue with. Danny argued with a crab and declared it emotionally unavailable. Dante told him to respect its boundaries. Serena laughed because ordinary absurdity felt like a miracle. Family talk arrived through jokes, grief, and a paper cone of fried calamari. Danny asked months earlier if loving Dante betrayed their parents. Serena said forgetting harm would betray them, but living without hate would not. The answer made room for memory and future together. On the beach, happiness frightened Dante because he finally understood what could be lost. Dante asked permission with a pause before taking Serena's hand. That pause mattered because respect lived in small daily choices. Their love had become less like rescue and more like practice. On the last evening before the message from Alvarez, Serena walked alone to the village pier. The stones were still warm from the day. Fishing boats knocked softly against their ropes. And somewhere behind her, Danny was teaching Basil to sit in 2 languages with no success at all. Serena carried her father's watch in her pocket. It no longer worked, but she kept it because broken things could still tell the truth. She sat at the edge of the pier and held it in her palm. For years, the stopped hands had meant only the hour everything ended. Now, without changing, the watch seemed to mean something else too. It meant there had been a before. Her father laughing in the kitchen. Her mother singing badly while folding towels. Danny small enough to fit under the table. Serena young enough to believe adults knew how to keep the world safe. Loss had tried to make the ending larger than all of that. Healing, she was learning, did not shrink the ending. It restored the rest of the story around it. Dante found her after a while, but stopped several feet away. "Do you want company?" he asked. She looked at the water, then at the watch. Quiet company. He sat beside her without touching. For several minutes, they listened to the tide. "I used to think if I understood every piece of Harbor Road, it would stop hurting," she said. "Does it?" "No, it hurts more honestly." Dante nodded. "I wish honesty were kinder." "It is kind. It just is not soft." He accepted that. She placed the watch between them. "My father fixed things. Radios, chairs, school projects. Give me the phone, Sophia." He thought anything could be understood if you were patient to take it apart without losing the screws. Dante looked at the cracked face of the watch. "He sounds like a man I would have respected. Maybe. Or maybe he would have hated you. Both would be fair." Serena smiled faintly. "He hated bullies, bad coffee, and people who parked across 2 spaces. Then I would have made a careful first impression." "You would have failed." Dante almost smiled, then let the silence return. That was why she could sit with him now. He no longer tried to turn every painful memory into a doorway for himself. He let her father belong to her. After a while, Serena put the watch back in her pocket. When Alvarez sent the message the next day, "I think part of me was ready because of this moment," she would later admit. "Not ready for another secret. Ready to face it without surrendering the peace we had already earned." The sea kept moving beneath the pier. No oath was spoken. No music swelled. Just 2 people sitting beside a broken watch, learning that the past could return and still not take every seat at the table. On the walk back, Serena heard Danny laughing before she saw him. That sound steadied her more than any prom could have. It reminded her that the future was not a courtroom, a confession, or a corrected file. It was also a boy chasing a dog through a square, a tired man buying too many pastries, and a woman discovering that vigilance and joy could live in the same body. She did not have to choose between remembering and living. She could do both, one ordinary breath at a time. And that, more than perfect safety, felt like the beginning of freedom again at last. Alvarez's message carried the past back across the ocean. Alvarez sent word that a new Harbor Road file had surfaced. A final witness was alive, and claimed Serena's father knew the Moretti family. Old truth rose from the grave before peace could become careless. No more secrets became less a promise than a rule they would have to practice. Dante handed Serena the phone instead of hiding the message. She said they would face it together. The past would not find the same wounded people it had once destroyed. Hope did not erase the storm ahead, but it let them walk toward it together. Danny shouted that Basil had found a sea cucumber, and the spell of fear broke. Serena laughed while the sea erased their footprints behind them. Hope ran barefoot through the surf and called them home.